Every year, as millions of Americans gather to celebrate Thanksgiving in their homes, many are unaware of the actual story and truth behind this holiday celebration. In school, most American children are taught that the Thanksgiving celebration serves as a feast to celebrate the discovery of America by Christopher Columbus. Specifically, they're taught that after an unidentified tribe of native people welcomed Pilgrims to America, they then taught the Pilgrims how to live and care for the land. Voluntarily gave up the land and then gathered for a celebration dinner, after which they all disappeared without a trace, like they never existed. The average school history book explains that the Native American people handed over the land to whites so that they could create a much happier and better nation, with opportunities and Christianity for other nations to benefit from. Due to these lapses in history books, the average American only thinks that the native people conceded to colonialism. While this might be subjectively true, there remains a history of Thanksgiving, albeit dark, the millions of Americans don't know about. It encompasses the killings, savage raping, and pillaging that the actual Native Americans endured before the Pilgrims took their land. So if you've never heard of this story, buckle up and brace yourself, because we're about to tell you the dark history of Thanksgiving, which is hidden from millions of Americans. The first Thanksgiving, as people would later come to understand and know it, happened over 400 years ago in 1621. It was between Pilgrims from the Plymouth colony and the Wampanoag tribe in what is now known in the present day as Massachusetts. While several records show that this gathering and celebration did happen, there are, however, a few misconceptions that eventually changed the course of history, as opposed to what it should have been. According to the New York Times, the Mayflower did and then renamed Plymouth. After their arrival, those Pilgrims held a 3-day feast, which members of the Wampanoag tribe attended. However, what these settlers actually did after they had what they referred to as Thanksgiving observances was fast. According to the New Yorker, the gathering and celebration was known as a rejoicing. With the fact in mind, people actually viewed it as the first Thanksgiving, although undocumented. It is possible that they might have served some turkey or other type of poultry, and there were no mashed potatoes or pie as we have today. So they would have most likely had seafood along a Wampanoag dish called naswamp, a porridge made of cornmeal, which the settlers had adopted. These generalizations around what might have happened in the first Thanksgivings are subjective truths. As the Smithsonian's notes, the discussion of this event is centered around the settlers. However, the Native Americans have been on the land centuries before their arrival, and the story based on their perspective predates this feast. So what exactly happened in between? When the early Europeans started coming to what we know as the United States 4 years prior to the arrival of Mayflower, they brought in foreign illness that killed most of the native people at the incredibly high rate. As a result, it became easier for the colonizers to overthrow the natives and take their land. But that wasn't the only motive of the settlers, or as we call them, colonizers. Their ulterior motive was to kidnap and sell the actual Native Americans into slavery. So in 1620, the leader of the Wampanoag people, named Massasoit, negotiated a treaty between the Wampanoag tribe and the Plymouth settlers, which included a mutual agreement that neither member of both groups would harm anyone from the other. The treaty also included an agreement that both parties would leave their weapons at home anytime they needed to trade to ensure further that they had peaceful commerce relationship. After several talks between the two groups, they mutually agreed to spend 3 days holding a feast together. But they're coming together with a fuzzy, warm tradition, like most people have been taught in school. From then on, the Pilgrims celebrated Thanksgiving in their traditional way of fasting and praying. In the next 10 years that followed, the Pilgrims and Massasoit remained close allies, trading English goods for Wampanoag land and access to several other natural resources. However, after Massasoit died in 1661, leaving his son, Wamsuta, tension between both groups started to simmer. Over 25,000 European colonizers arrived from 1630 to 1642. And during that period, a deadly plague decimated over half of the native population. Wamsuta himself died under mysterious circumstances while he was on a journey visiting the Puritans to hold peace talks about the increasing unrest between both groups. Wamsuta's successor, Mete Comet, was very different from him. He only fanned the flames, and in 1675, 3 native people were publicly executed for killing. A man who served as a translator to the European settlers. The death of the 3 natives resulted in more distrust between the 2 groups. The Mete Comet group, fearing that the natives would lose more than their land to the settlers. To prevent it from happening, Mete Comet built a coalition among several native tribes to protect themselves and their resources from the settlers. By the autumn of 1675, the settlers and coalition members started clashing frequently, with the settlers attacking several of the native settlements in Massachusetts and Connecticut. Initially, the Narragansett tribe took a neutral stance in the clash. However, they would not give up the Wampanoag, who were seeking refuge in their camp, or turn away children, women, and the elderly from tribes who came seeking shelter with them. As a result of their generosity and neutral role, the Puritans launched a devastating attack on the Narragansett stronghold. The attack and its aftermath led to the death of 150 settlers and 600 natives. That attack and conflict further devastated the native population, and what was later known in history as King Philip War ensued. It was named after Metacom's English moniker. The conflicts that followed greatly affected both the colonies and the native tribes. To gain leverage in conflicts, Wampanoag abducted several settlers and held them for ransom. In retaliation, the settlers robbed and destroyed several native villages. Most of them burned, and looted colonies took several decades to recover from the damages done fully. According to a publication from the Historical Journal of Massachusetts, the war claimed over 30% of the entire English population and half the population of Native Americans in what is known now as New England. The war eventually ended when Mete Comet was killed in a brutal fashion, beheaded and dismembered in Rhode Island. The rest of his allies were either executed or sold off into slavery in the West Indies. The settlers impacted the head of King Philip on a spike and displayed it in the Plymouth for 25 years as a macabre effigy to the strife. After King Philip War ended, there were other battles and conflicts that raged in Connecticut, Virginia, New York, and several other places where the American population never really recovered. As a result, the several times Thanksgiving happened in the United States in the early days was because of the massacres of Native people, including the 1637 massacre, when Massachusetts colony governor John Winthrop set aside a day for Thanksgiving after some volunteers killed over 700 Pequot people. This incident is mostly cited as the first official mentioning of a Thanksgiving ceremony, and is another commonly cited origin story for the Thanksgiving we know today. However, the dark truth of the event remains that Thanksgiving began due to the bloodshed that occurred between several Native American tribes and the first European settlers, as opposed to what we know today. Despite the dark history, the Great Dinner became the focal point of the modern Thanksgiving holiday, leaving millions of Americans with a general misconception they might never know about. Silverman, a historian at George Washington University, explained that for a long time, the English people had previously been celebrating Thanksgiving without feasting, but with fasting and supplication to God. Things started to change in 1769, when some group of Pilgrim descendants living in Plymouth started to feel like their cultural authority was fading away, as New England became less relevant in the colonies and early republic. Seeing the need to boost tourism, they started planting the seed of the idea that Pilgrims were the fathers of America. Several people later believed the story due to a publication mentioning the dinner published by the Rev. Alexander Young included a footnote that said, "This was the first Thanksgiving." the Great Festival of New England. As a result, people decided to pick on that particular footprint, making the idea widely accepted. It also led to Abraham Lincoln's declaration of the holiday during the Civil War to foster unity. It gained more support towards the end of the 19th century, when there was increased agitation and anxiety over imagination. The white Protestant stock of the United States was displeased with the nature and number of Jews and European Catholics coming to the United States, because it couldn't exert control over them. So in order to do so, it created a national founding around the Pilgrims and the Indians, inviting them to take over the land. The racial politics of the late 19th century also affected this myth. With the Indian War coming to an end, it was a great opportunity to include the Indians in the national founding myth. They couldn't have done that in an era where most people were reading newspapers frequently about the atrocities and violence committed by the white Americans and the native people in the West. What's more, during the Reconstruction era, the Thanksgiving myth allowed New England to develop and adopt the idea that a colonial era without bloodshed was the origin of the country, without mentioning of the Indian wars and slavery. The goal was to make Americans feel good about their colonial past, without the need to confront the really dark history of it. The discrepancies between the English and the Wampanoag conceptions of property were also another area blurring the dark history of Thanksgiving. Contrary to the widely accepted belief that the native people had zero sense of property, they did, in fact. While they didn't have private properties, they had community property with an understanding of where people's land started and ended. So when the Europeans came to America to purchase land from the Wampanoags, Wampanoag people thought the Europeans were buying into the Wampanoag country out from under their feet. To put it into context, imagine a fleet of Wampanoag's boats crossing over the Atlantic and going to England. Upon reaching there, the Wampanoags purchase land from the English people there. When that happens, will the land be passed out of jurisdiction of England and become the Wampanoags? No, that's the correct answer. But that's exactly what the English people were thinking on their side of the Atlantic. Part of King Philip's War was all about the Wampanoags people saying, "Enough! You're not going to turn us into a landless subjugated people." During King Philip's War, most efforts to unify different tribes against the settlers were often met with disagreement. This was largely because the politics adopted by the Indian countries were more important to the native people than their differences with the colonists. When the English people arrived, there were no Indians. It was an identity they had to learn through shared struggles with colleagues. Considering they've been there for over 12,000 plus years with several differences between them, their focus was mainly on their own people, not on the shared interests of Indians. And very oftenly, what was in the best interest of their own people was cutting deals with colonial powers, with an eye towards combating their native rivals. Despite the claims that all the Wampanoags wanted to enter into alliance with the English people, some didn't. From the start, a notable number of Wampanoags didn't agree with their leader's decision to reach out to the English, and as such, they made several attempts to undermine the alliance. Their leader, Osamoquin, stopped several plans and plots to exterminate the colony and overthrow him. Some Wampanoags wanted the alliance with the Narragansetts just to get rid of the English, as they were responsible for raiding their coast for decades, enslaving their people, carrying them off to unknown fates, and therefore could not be trusted. Others believed they caused epidemics, and they were prophecies that they would be the end of their people. When the English people arrived, they met a multilateral Indian political system where the internal and intertribal politics of the Wampanoag tribe were paramount. Based on the Wampanoag's dealings with the English, it was simply to change the power dynamics of the Indian country. One of the reasons why Thanksgiving in the United States will remain controversial for a long time to come is due to the atrocities against the Native Americans. The atrocities didn't end with massacres or diseases, so seeing people celebrate a positive history around Thanksgiving every year can be painful and frustrating for many people who know the dark side of history. That, combined with the fact that some non-natives often choose to wear headdresses in honor of Thanksgiving, is seen as a mockery of sacred dress by many. Like all groups, Native Americans aren't monolithic and usually have varying views on Thanksgiving. For instance, some tribes, those who dwell on the dark history, see it as a national day of mourning. a day when settlers came to their land, spurring several decades of violence and mistreatment. According to the United American Indians of New England, Thanksgiving Day is a reminder of the genocide of millions of native people, the theft of native land, and the relentless assault on native culture. Having marked the occasion as a day of mourning for 48 years, the organization said, "Participants in National Day of Mourning honor native ancestors and struggling of native people to survive today. It is a day of remembrance and spiritual connection, as well as a protest of the racism and oppression which Native America continues to experience." Other people, like the founder and CEO of the Sioux Chef and the author of the Sioux Chef Indigenous Kitchen, Sean Sherman, may also have painful and complicated feelings about this holiday, but are adopting new ways to observe it. He said, "The thing is, we don't need the poisonous Pilgrims and Indian narratives. We do not need that illusion of the past unity to actually unite people today. Instead, we can focus simply on values that apply to everybody: togetherness, generosity, and gratitude. And we can make that day about what everybody wants to talk about and think about anyway: the food. People may not realize it, but what every person in this country shares, and the very history of this nation has been in front of us this whole time. Most of our Thanksgiving recipes are made with indigenous food: turkey, corn, beans, pumpkins, maple, wild rice, and the like. We should embrace this." While Thanksgiving has been constantly celebrated in the United States, the federal government proclaims the dates at regular intervals in the past. In the mid-19th century, after a few decades of lobbying by Sarah Joseph Hale, a magazine editor, a national Thanksgiving holiday was established. As the holiday started gaining roots in the United States, there became an increased need for a distinctive American origin story. So the Harvest Festival, which took place 2 centuries earlier, was remade to become the first Thanksgiving. The current national holiday has its roots in one of the nation's most bitter moments of diversion: the Civil War. On October 3rd, 1863, the then President Abraham Lincoln declared the date as the new day for Thanksgiving, as a way to help unite a nation weary from war. Abraham Lincoln wasn't the first president to declare Thanksgiving, but his declaration set a trend for it, to be observed every last Thursday of November each year for decades to come. In 1939, the last Thursday of November was the last day of the month. So, in a bid to prevent the short holiday shopping season from dampening the nation's recovery from the Great Depression, Franklin D. Roosevelt, the then president, issued a presidential declaration to move Thanksgiving from the last Thursday of November to a week prior. After the declaration, 16 states objected to the change, and for the next 2 years, Thanksgiving in the United States had 2 different dates. In 1941, Congress passed a new law to settle the confusion. The law declared the 4th Thursday of November as the federal Thanksgiving Day holiday, which is what we have till today. While the traditional Thanksgiving celebration continues to evolve with each passing generation of Americans bringing new patterns and meaning to how it's celebrated. The tradition of coming together to share a meal and reflect on the past year and all the things worth being grateful for is the current theme. However, regardless of this, there are still people who will never forget its dark history. If you enjoyed watching this video, do leave a like and subscribe to this channel for more interesting stories and hidden secrets.